She works over at Planned Parenthood as the Senior Director of News Content. And that is Kate Smith joining us. Kate, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys.
Kate, we're going to get into a bunch of stuff here, all the work that Planned Parenthood's doing, the decision that came down, obviously, a couple of weeks back from the Supreme Court, and all the different trigger laws that went into effect, everything that's happening in the different states. The first thing I wanted to get from you is, Nick and I are both girl dads. We both have two daughters each. I don't know, and they're younger ages, all of them under the age of 7. I don't know how I would feel as seeing what's happening right now unfolding in this country play out, where a woman's right to choose what she does with her body has been taken away in a multitude of states. I wanted to ask you, as somebody who kind of lives this dual life where you are a woman and also you work for a company that is responsible for helping women get access to whatever reproductive care that they feel that they can have with their body. When you heard the decision, when you knew that the draft was released, back in December, or the questions that were happening during the Mississippi case, what were some of the emotions that kind of came up for you, and how have you kind of channeled that into your work and your personal life?
That's a really interesting question. And I would actually back that up all the way to September, which is when you saw Texas, their ability they had a 6-week abortion ban. And I had covered abortion policy and sexual and reproductive health and women's issues for CBS News for a long time. And and it was all in the hypothetical. It was all like, an abortion ban gets passed but doesn't get implemented, or, all of these kind of crazy laws that didn't have real impact. And seeing Texas actually be able to implement what was truly an unthinkable abortion ban, and seeing patients in real time experiencing that, even with Roe in place, it was it was it was I don't want to say the word unbelievable, because we had spent so much time saying that this was a very real potential could happen, but it was a gut punch, right? I mean, it was devastating, it was infuriating. And seeing people, and especially communities of color, low income communities, and seeing those are the ones getting just impacted so severely by this, disproportionately. It's actually what led me to talk to Planned Parenthood, because it was kind of, you saw all these things happening. And at the time I wasn't at CBS, I was working in communications elsewhere. And it was a really big moment for me, because it was one of those moments where it was like, it became so real and so obviously real so fast. So, I mean, as an individual, gut punch, disbelief, stunned. But then kind of professionally, it led me to go want to do something about it, to be honest.
Yeah, to that point about doing something, we saw, I mean, obviously what Texas did, obviously what you're doing in your work now with the organization. One of the things we like to do on this show is provide space for literacy, what we call literacy moments. Kate, demystify for all of us Planned Parenthood. Obviously, when we get into the conversation, the arguments from the right to life, Planned Parenthood tends to be a target of that movement. I would like to say movement ignorance is the word I tend to operatively use. But with that fervor, Planned Parenthood almost always is a target. Can you just take us for a moment through just really the mission for Planned Parenthood? What is the organization all about? And what is its impact on the support of women's reproductive health?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for asking that question. Planned Parenthood, well, let's back up. Planned Parenthood deals with sexual and reproductive health in all capacities. And the reason for that is because sexual and reproductive health has always been a target of, conservative lawmakers, whether it's, access to birth control, whether it's access to abortion, even like, some sort of like, prenatal care and things like that. It's always been a target. Women's bodies have always been a target for conservative politicians. We know that. So unfortunately, what that means is that insurance plans, hospitals, family physicians, often women's health care and sexual and reproductive health care gets cut out of that equation. So that's where Planned Parenthood comes in. We're almost 100-year organization that focuses exclusively on sexual and reproductive health, and especially helping those people that are on the margins, who aren't able to get that care in via their OBGYN. I mean, I think what a lot of people don't realize is, A lot of insurance carriers don't cover birth control. A lot of insurance carriers don't cover abortion. They don't do all these things that are just healthcare and things that women and other people who can become pregnant need in their life. So we kind of fill that gap and focus exclusively on that. And those are through our incredible network of affiliates that are all over the country. So that's the Planned Parenthood affiliates. And then additionally, we have our political group that helps us and supports our ability to keep doing so. Often you see Planned Parenthood attorneys in the courts, right? So, I mean, one of the biggest abortion rights cases at the Supreme Court, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, of course, right? So what we're also doing on the other end of the spectrum is we are defending our patients' rights to access that abortion or that birth control or that gender affirming care. But at the heart of it, Planned Parenthood is all about empowering our patients to live their life the way they choose to live it, regardless of what, their insurance carrier says or what other people say. So it's really all about just empowering women and other people who can become pregnant, and men too. We do a lot of men's care as well. So it's really all about empowering people to, have control over their bodies and live their lives to the fullest.
I'll follow up that with a question around your work with the organization and really helping to craft the message and making sure all of us, including these hosts, are informed about the work of the organization. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like the momentum, the argument for the right to life has, grown exponentially, or things have shifted. Like we seem to be in a place, and I bring this up only because I remember seeing anti-abortion activists, at the Supreme Court, younger women, surprisingly, that had signs that had talked about being in a post-Roe America, which again, stunning for me. But what's been your viewpoint from just where you sit with, being able to support the messaging for Planned Parenthood, but seeing the opposite messaging and how it's taking hold in spaces that we didn't think were possible previously? But is that a fair assessment that the anti-abortion message seems to have grown, evolved, permeated further into states than we've seen in previous generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw a big shift in the way the anti-abortion groups crafted their message, right? So, and I should say this, this is coming from my experience as a reporter covering these movements. Previously, up until quite recently, the anti-abortion movement was all about like religion, right? It was these people come from like a fundamentalist Christian point of view where they don't like abortion and they don't think anyone should be able to have abortion. Okay. Well, obviously, if you live in America, that you can't create laws based on your religion. You have freedom from religion, right? So it was kind of a non-starter in terms of like it gaining like a large popularity, or even kind of like a real assessment to be able to go after Roe with an inherently religious argument, right? So you saw kind of this shift towards trying to root themselves in scientific messaging, all of the air quotes possible. And what that looks like is, rather than talking about God and Jesus and all of like the Christian values of why they believe what they believe, they came up with some very, I mean, look, like, let's put our cards on the table, very successful, clever messaging about why they wanted the bans that they did. And I think the biggest example of that would be the so-called heartbeat bans, right? So these were a series of anti-abortion bans, right, that really gained popularity in 2019, and they called themselves heartbeat bans. But if you read the state legislation, they redefined what heartbeat means literally on the very first page. You can look this up. This isn't me telling you this. And they redefined it as kind of like this like electrical cardiac activity that happens around 6 weeks. And so when you're thinking about how they really picked up steam, there's a few things going on. It's that messaging, that shift really away from religion. And like, let's be honest and clear, like they still are very much based in religion. They just realize that can't be the public view of it, right? That will not work. So kind of the messaging and shifting it over to that the quote unquote science, again, not real science. Even they know it's not real science, otherwise they would feel the need to redefine all these scientific terms. But then again, you have to also like look at the Supreme Court's makeup, right? So if you're looking at a 4-5 or 5-4 ideology on the court, you're probably not going to do anything with Roe. But you saw an incredible momentum right after Justice Kavanaugh was appointed, and you saw an even bigger momentum after Justice Barrett was put on the court. So I think it's like the two things. There was like a messaging change that was inherently more successful for them and easier to palate. And then on the other side, there were actual real pathways to what they wanted to do, which, you know, when there's a real pathway in place, it's much easier to energize the base. But I have to throw this out there. The support for legal abortion has actually only increased. So, you know, polling from like Gallup or, you know, nonpartisan polling does show that the support for legal abortion has only increased in the past 10 years. So even though you're seeing these very vocal anti-abortion activists, I would call them a vocal minority that have just become more vocal with those pathways in place.
You should mention Kate, Bloomberg News, Financial Times, CBS News. So very accredited in the journalistic space, way beyond Nick and I. And that's why we have her on the show. Kate, I want to stay on that because you mentioned a bunch of things there in terms of media coverage. And I mentioned to you off air how we saw you on Reliable Sources with Brian Stelter over on CNN Sundays at 11. And I can't help but think, as a former news producer myself, that, you know, the media's coverage of some of this, where do you net out as a former reporter? Because now you went in-house to an org, like you said, to kind of control the messaging. But where do you net out where the media has played a role in terms of making this issue either divisive or the lack of understanding about certain things? Because at the end of the day, it should be about a right for a woman to choose what she does with her body. There should be nobody legislating what you do with your body. Point blank. Like, this is not, again, nothing science rooted or anything like that. This is, you want to take it as Mike Leon's opinion, that's fine. It's a majority opinion, like you mentioned, that people should have access to this. So where do you feel that the media has either struck out or maybe gotten some hits and made a dent in like the messaging part of this? Like, where do you net out? And that, as someone who used to be in the media space, you know, doing some of this reporting on some of these topics, like you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think I don't want to, you know, speak negatively about all of the incredible reporters that cover this issue, because as from my experience covering this issue is I've covered other beats in my career. I started off as a municipal bond reporter. I did finance and hedge funds, and this is by far the most difficult beat I have ever covered in my life. And a lot of it is, you know, the nuance, but then also it's all of the flack that you get if you don't use the term pro-life, which, by the way, AP Style says that you should not use the word pro-life. So that's not an opinion. It's just, you know, normal journalistic standards is that you should not use that term. If you don't use that term, be prepared for a flood of terrible DMs, horrible harassment online. I've got regular death threats constantly. My security was always a problem covering this issue. So I don't want to speak poorly about anyone who's covering this because it's difficult. But the inherent problem is the way it's presented. Think about like any abortion story you've seen on network news, for example. They always like lead in the story with like the debate of our generation or like this divisive issue. And the reality is the facts of the matter are that it's really not this like controversial issue. It's 80% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in some capacity. Recent polling from actually CBS, my alma mater, said that only 9% of Americans want their state to ban abortion. 9%. So why are we covering it as this like, well, this side says this and that side says this? It's not really that. It's here, 91% of people don't want their state to ban abortion and 9% do. And the reason why I bring that up and why I bring up polling is because that should be the way you're framing these issues, right? It's not, I think there's like, it's like journalistic malpractice to frame these stories in a 50-50 way, right? Like, have the doctor here and then have the activist there and clean it up nice and tight. You have a 2.5-minute package. No, I think that totally misses the point, because that doesn't account for the fact that 91% of people actually agree with the doctor and only 9% agree with this fringe activist. And that doesn't even take into account that we're putting up an activist whose entire life's work is to try to ban abortion against a doctor who spent over 10 years understanding how reproductive systems in the human body work. I mean, that's in and of itself, that's a completely ridiculous comparison. And TV, news, network, newspapers, everyone does this. But then you also include the polling. And I think the reason I bring this all up is because, there's obviously the polling, but then what I'm really interested in is the perception. So if you ask someone in the street, like, hey, how many Americans do you think support the right to abortion? They probably wouldn't get to 8 and 10 because we present it as so different in the media. And I think people get nervous to share their support. And so when we talk about how did we get to this point, how did we get so far? And I think it's because it's very, unless you're reading the polling and you're super deep into it, I would guess that not as many people realized that also agreed with them, that they were actually in the majority by not wanting Roe versus Wade to get overturned, and by not wanting their state to ban abortion, and by believing abortion should be legal.
I love that point.
Yeah, well said. Really well said.
It's not 50-50, it's 91-9. That should be the title of this episode.
Right?
I will do something about that. Yeah.
Kate, shifting this to the conversation of help for the organization that you represent, for the support of women's reproductive rights. There's no one, it's hard to argue that we are not experiencing dark days right now. What can we, I'm going to do something I normally don't like to do in broadcasting, but I'm going to ask you a two-part question. Part one is, what can people do right now to currently support an organization like Planned Parenthood that it's fighting the good fight for reproductive rights? But at the same time, if you are in a state like Texas, where it has become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to get an abortion, what options do you currently have?
So let's go with the patient question first. If you are in a situation where you live in a state where abortion is no longer legal, you can go to abortionfinder.org and they will help you figure out what your options are. So abortionfinder.org, tattoo it everywhere, put it on a billboard. In terms of what, if you're a supporter and what you can do to help, there's a few different answers. So the first answer is get involved. We were just talking about how people don't realize that they're in the majority about if they support the right to abortion, right? So the best way to do that right now is go join a protest. Go, I know it's lame, but post something on your social media, where there's all sorts of different ways that you can get involved and show up to say that you don't agree with what's going on. You believe in having power over your body, right? You can find out about all sorts of different activations and protests on bansoff.org. So that's a really comprehensive place where you can find anything that's in your local community and get involved. So that's a really, really big piece about doing this, right? Show that you are in the majority, dismantle this idea that this is a 50-50 issue, because it is not, but let's make sure it is impossible to ignore that fact, right? The second thing that you can do is you can donate, obviously. So I would recommend donating to an abortion fund. So abortion funds, especially in states where access has been completely cut off or severely cut off, what these abortion funds do is they actually work with individual patients and help them overcome those obstacles so they can access the procedure. So I know we say, okay, abortion's banned, it's really hard to get, but when you really think about all the different obstacles that you need to overcome to get access. So we're talking about, obviously, the travel. I mean, look at gas prices right now. So imagine if you have to travel 100 miles to go get a procedure. That's really expensive. Childcare costs. The average abortion patient already has a child. So you're thinking about childcare costs, time off of work. In a lot of situations, the patient has to spend the night, so a hotel, food. I mean, these costs add up really quickly. And then you're not even talking about the cost of the procedure, right? So abortion tends to cost, starts at around, and assuming this isn't your insurance covers it, but starts generally around $500, and it just gets more and more expensive from there. So, I feel like there's always that viral story that comes out that the average American doesn't have $500 for a financial emergency, right? Well, this is minimum $500. So, abortion funds really, really are so critical in helping patients and in a very tangible, really direct way. And when I talk about giving, I should also mention that rage giving is amazing. If you were blindly mad and you gave money, that is awesome. But what is really, really impactful is if you can set up a recurring donation. So $5 once a month, and it just gets taken out of your bank account if that's available to you, if that's possible. That makes a really big difference, because the reality of this is that we're not going to fix this next month. We're not going to fix this in October. This is going to be a really, really long fight. So setting up that infrastructure to help these patients is really, really critical. And tangential to that, my final thing of how you can help is, we talk about how states are banning abortion, and we estimate that about 26 states will likely ban abortion by kind of once all the dust settles in this post-Roe world, right? About 26 states. Another way of thinking about that is that 24 states are now absorbing 26 states, double the amount of patients that they serve. And these are small clinics. These aren't these like big hospitals that can handle that influx of patients. It means that there's a lot more work to be done. They're extending, I've talked to these clinics, they're extending their hours. These doctors are like working 7 days a week. So they need volunteers more than ever before. And there's a million different ways you can volunteer, whether it's clinic escorting or, helping out inside the clinic, whatever your capacity is. Every little bit really, really helps, because those clinics that are obviously the ones that have to shut down, it's heartbreaking, but the ones that are still there, they need your help more than ever before. So those are kind of some ways that people can help as a supporter.
I can see now why Planned Parenthood gave her this title and brought her in-house, because she does fantastic work sending out and spreading out the messaging from Planned Parenthood. Kate Smith, the Senior Director of News Content over there. Kate, I can't thank you enough, not only for sharing your personal story on how this kind of affected you, but all the work that you guys are doing over at Planned Parenthood. And you can go into our show links page. Some of the links there that Kate mentioned will be available in our show notes page if you want to click on that. Kate, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Continued success to you. Please stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.